Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're really excited. We got a great response for this webinar. So seems to be a hot topic and something people are interested in hearing about. So we're happy to be able to share it. We're going to be sharing the results of some research we did. We thought, it would be interesting to kind of talk to research and insights leaders in the industries where we play to kind of see what's going on, see what people are doing, see what the challenges are, what the trends are, what they see coming down the pike. And we're going to be sharing the results of that today with you. So what we did a series of qualitative webcam interviews with insights and research leaders, professionals in the four sort of verticals where we do a lot of our work. Many of them were Zeldis clients, not all of them. Some folks who are not current clients were willing to talk to us, so we really appreciated that. We ended up talking to or representing 5 companies in the health insurance space. These are the kind of 4 verticals where Zeldis does its work. 5 in the P&C insurance market, 5 financial services, and financial services is broad. It doesn't include like banks and credit cards. We don't do as much work there. It's more investment, life insurance, annuities, some fintech when we say financial services. And then 4 folks who represent non-medical group benefits. Obviously, health insurance has medical group benefits, but we also do a lot of work in the non-medical group benefit space. I will say this adds up to 19. We actually did 16 interviews because there are a few of folks that are at companies that have both of these verticals, right? So there's a couple companies we work with that are both have a financial services side and a group benefit side. One company that has P&C and financial services. So they're kind of double counting in those buckets, but I only double counted them if the person I spoke to does work for both of those industries, right? Not if it's siloed and separate. So I also want to mention that of the 16 companies represented here, 11 of them are Fortune 500 companies. So we're talking about big national companies for the most part. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear what they have to say. Um, so let's start kind of talk about, oh, and I should mention they're supposed to be a half hour. We got talky. Most of them went closer to 45 minutes or an hour. So we were able to really kind of get deep and hear a lot of perspective, which was great. They were conducted by myself and my colleagues who lead up our practices in these spaces. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of, we asked a little bit about how is the research and insights function structured? Kind of what does it look like? What does the team look like? What are the responsibilities? How is it structured in the organization? So what we heard is there's really no one size fits all. There was a lot of variety. But I will say that there is definitely a trend towards centralization. So a trend towards having most primary insights and research housed in one group or department, varying degrees of success, right? So only a few have like every aspect of research and insights in one area. Most have most of it there, but often there'll be something most commonly like UX, for example, might fall under IT, or maybe there's a separate CX function. Um, Maybe there's a secondary competitive intelligence, but most of it in one space. There are a couple of folks we spoke to who are truly siloed, who really have different research folks or teams in different departments in their organization, usually by product or business line. What we heard is that even those folks would prefer to be centralized. The general consensus is that centralization is better. When it's siloed or it's more fragmented, generally they try to do meetings or have a centralized data, storage or server, but it's hard to communicate across. And so there can be like duplication, folks working on the same thing because they don't know what the other research group is working on. So the general feeling is that centralized is better. Sometimes they're considered, I heard a couple people throw around center of excellence, that's how they labeled their research and insights group, as a center of excellence. I'll also mention that there is, and I'm sure those of you who are in the industry, or this doesn't surprise you, there's sometimes what I like to call rogue research going on in the organization. So even if there's a centralized function, there's folks who just go off on their own and either contract outside or do a survey monkey or do their own research, which can be A bit of a nuisance, I think, is what we heard because they're not applying the rigor. They don't have the background. And so that isn't ideal, but I wouldn't say it's a major challenge. I would say it's more of a nuisance from what we heard. In terms of how they report, most report through marketing, but we did hear others who report to senior leadership in this, like a chief strategy officer in strategy, couple through a product area. But the most common is through a CMO or through marketing, and that's generally preferred. Size is all over the place. So I talk to people who have a two-person team, and I talk to people who have 15, 20 people. And there is a connection to the size of the company, as you would expect, right? You expect it to be a straight correlation. The bigger the company, the bigger the department. But that isn't always the case. And often it's more correlated to the perceived value of research within the organization by senior leadership. So what we heard is when senior leadership really values research and is really, thinks that it can drive business, there's bigger teams, more folks, more resources, and vice versa. And finally, again, if you've been in the industry like I have for a long time, you will know that even within the same organization, there tend to be shifts. There tends to be reorgs, largely driven by changes in senior leadership, CEO, CMO, where we're centralized. Now we're siloed. Now we're centralized, or we report in through here, and now we report in through here. And so what we heard is that there is not a lot of stability in the organizational structure of the research function, that over time, sometimes every 3 years, sometimes every 5 years or 10 years, but there tend to be shifts. So all of this is point in time, right? This trend centralization, seeing that as the gold standard, that's where we are right now. Okay, so let's talk about some of the challenges that folks face internally within their department, some of what we heard there. And again, as Brad mentioned, feel free to chat in the chat, send me a question at any point, and I will answer it. You don't need to wait till the end. What are some of the most common challenges? The biggest heard by almost everyone is budget. And 15 of the 16 folks we spoke to said their budget has been flat or declining in the last couple of years. Only one person mentioned an increase in budget. So that is across the board, definitely a trend that research budgets, people are not funneling a lot of new money into research. We heard more flat than decreasing, which is better than hearing more decreasing, right? So that was probably the most common answer. But what we're seeing is what that means is another challenge is needing to do more with less. And we'll touch on this in a future slide, but the idea that, you know, you might have less money, you might have the same money, there might be more demand. You need to figure out ways to make your budget stretch, to be able to do more with less money, fewer resources. Another thing we're going to touch on, we'll have a separate slide on this, is this idea of demonstrating the value of the research function, the return on investment. So how can we show the company that we are of value and that what we are doing is of value? That is something that is a priority and was mentioned by a lot of the people we spoke to. And we'll see kind of different ways people do that with varying degrees of success. Staffing and bandwidth, which ties into doing more with less, right? We don't have budget, we don't have headcount. We're hearing from people that, folks are stretched in some cases, especially when you have those smaller departments, right? Where they're doing more or where a lot of it's internal. Folks have a lot on their plate, and finding ways to manage that effectively can be challenging. And then this idea of balancing speed and quality. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard the triangle, right? Cost, speed, and quality. So cost is overlaying all of this, right? That the budget piece is there. But then this idea of getting things done really quickly, versus a little more rigorously with making sure that the quality is there, and sort of that can be in conflict. And how do you decide when to do something kind of fast, maybe cheaper, faster, versus when you need to kind of take your time, make sure it's of the highest quality. And so that's something we heard about as well, that folks are trying to figure out and trying to work with their business partners to get on the same page around that. And then finally, compliance. Not surprisingly, we're talking about insurance and financial services. Compliance is king. especially in health insurance across the board, but in health insurance, I would say even more. The idea of PII, PHI, data privacy, data security, making sure you're compliant with any government regulations. All of that can tie things up and slow things down, make it challenging to do things like use new tools like AI, which we'll talk about in a bit. There can be a bit of a loggerhead when it comes to compliance and AI. So that is a challenge as well. So how are some folks dealing with these challenges? What are some of the ways that they're trying to overcome them? Um, one thing that we heard from, I'd say, a significant minority is an increased focus on data analytics. So the idea that instead of going out and collecting new primary data every time, we have all this data. We have previous primary data, we have secondary data, we have sales data, we have customer data. So using all the data that is already there and building systems and tools to leverage that data for insights. And not that that doesn't cost any money, but it's more of an internal. It can cost less money. It can kind of take advantage of a resource that is already in place. So we've heard from a couple people that there's been an increased focus on that. I will say, speaking to what I said before about sort of shifts and things move in cycles, we also spoke to folks who there was a trend on more data analytics, and so they got away from primary data collection, and then um, it wasn't enough, and then they went back. So, like everything, this may be a cycle, but we are hearing that more of a focus on sort of internal data, and potentially using AI as part of that, although not seeing that so much yet. Um, Quick and dirty. I mentioned that speed versus quality. Lots of folks have found ways to do things more quickly, even if it isn't perfect, but getting an answer in a couple days or a week, instead of spending 6 or 7 or 8 weeks on a more uh, thorough study with a different sample base. There's some partners, vendors, tools out there that give you access to people quickly, even if it isn't perfect. And again, it's finding that balance of what are the studies, what are the questions that need answering, where quick and dirty is fine, versus the ones maybe that are a little more high profile, high risk, where you need something that's a little more rigorous, and finding that balance. One thing we heard is when client or business partners internally get used to quick and dirty, they don't want slow. Even if you're trying to make the argument for why that might be, in this case, we need to take a little more time, that can become an issue as well. Internal communities, it's become really standard now. I think almost everyone we work with, everyone I spoke to, has some kind of internal community. Maybe not for all of their audiences. Maybe it's just end client, consumer. Maybe it's a couple B2B audiences, but most folks have some way to quickly uh, interview or get data from an internal community that they're managing that's existing, that they don't have to go out and find them. That has definitely been something that has become kind of a standard. There's challenges in that as well, but it allows for you to have a resource to go to almost immediately. Um, they're demonstrating value. It's when I said one of the challenges is demonstrating value. One of the ways they're solving that is by demonstrating value. And on the next slide, we're gonna talk about exactly how they're doing that, or some folks are doing that. And then AI tools, slowly working towards that. Again, we're gonna spend more time talking about that going forward. There's not much yet being actively done, more in the works, but it's certainly something people are thinking about it as a way of dealing with the, budget challenges and less is more and speed. It comes up a lot. So how do folks demonstrate ROI? First, we have some quotes here that kind of relate to the things I'm going to bring up. So you can take your time to read those as I go through. But the most important, or at least what I'm hearing is the most effective, what we heard in these interviews is the most effective, is hard metrics and measurement. So we talked to folks who actually measure NPS for their research that they do. So they have a metric of the NPS, from their business partners of what they do. Folks trying to tie what they do to business metrics. So, all companies have target business metrics, and tying the research, tying the insights to those is very effective in demonstrating value. Measuring the money. If there's a way to demonstrate direct or even indirect ROI of research by saying, okay, we tested this, we launched this product instead of this product, or this concept instead of this one. Here's how it sold. Here's how the money we made, or um, tying, one of the quotes talks about work that helps to build retention and how does retention tie to financial metrics, right? So finding a way to tie the research being done to the bottom line of the company. Um, Communicating. So those first two we heard are as effective. Relatively speaking, not that many people are doing that because that takes bandwidth too, right? We're already talking about bandwidth is tough and we're trying to do more with less. And this is more bandwidth that's needed to do that. So I would say of the 16 people we talked to, only 4 or 5 are really doing those first two pieces rigorously and intentionally. One person talked about, and I think it might be represented in this quote here, they have an internal community. Every time they do a study in that community, they calculate how much that would cost if they use an external vendor. And so they are like documenting what they're saving by having the internal community. But that's rare. That's like maybe a third of the folks we spoke to. More common is just communicating, right? Making sure the people in the organization know what you're doing. Obviously, you're reporting out internally on individual projects and engagements, but a lot of folks have a more formal, a quarterly newsletter or a quarterly meeting or share out, or they do internal webinars to like what I'm doing right now to talk about the work they've done. So really sharing it in the organization. And then the last one, providing data to the stakeholders, giving them direct access to data demonstrates value. It demonstrates sort of what you're doing and helps them do their jobs and helps them use it. And that demonstrates the effectiveness. Um, I think all of this, is seen as really important. And there is definitely some gaps here. So some of the folks I talked to are doing a lot of these things very intentionally and really putting it into their business plan. And other folks are like, I wish I could do more. So I definitely think there's room here to put some things in place from some of the folks that aren't doing these things. I want to spend a minute to talk about what I'm calling the catch-22 of success in demonstrating value, right? So we talked about budgets and do less with more. And we talked about the importance of demonstrating value to the organization and ROI. So what I heard in interviews, and some of these interviews, not all, um, we do research and we effectively demonstrate our value and our ROI. And our business partners are like, this is great. This is really helping drive the organization forward. This is so valuable. Let's do a lot more of this. Oh, you did this and it was so effective. Now let's talk to this audience, or let's talk to that audience, or let's ask these questions. I want to do more. But you don't have any more money. You don't have any more people. And somehow you've demonstrated the value. Everybody now wants what you do. And now you're kind of trapped in having sort of the same head count that you had before, right? So sorry, pull up a quote here. We haven't grown in terms of team size, but we are working with more people internally, meaning the more people that we work with, the more people hear about us, the more people see our work, the more people come to us with questions and different things they want our help with. So this was someone I spoke to that had a team of 2, but they're doing a great job and everybody loves it and people want more work. They don't have any more people. So that in and of itself presents a challenge. And I come back to what I had on the previous slide. What we heard is that the better you can more formally communicate the ROI through metrics and measurement and money, the more likely you are to be able to bring in more headcount and get more resources. The folks I spoke to that are doing that most actively and most effectively are the ones with the biggest teams that have the most resources. So there's a direct connection there to being able to say, look what we're doing and look what it's doing for the company. I need another person, or I need more budget to be able to do this, but continue to do this effectively. So I want to talk a little bit about just what kinds of research are really hot right now. What are people doing more often? What are they being asked to do more often? And kind of starting at just the high level, general topics, not industry specific. Um, we hear product and concept innovation was the number one thing we heard as a priority. more and more thought leadership when I asked about trends. This idea of not just doing things internally, but doing things externally to help build relationships and build brand and marketing tracking, CX and journey, always things, both of those that have been important historically and continue to be. Did hear a little bit, again, a lot of the industries we work in have a B2B component and a B2C, and often a B2B to C. We did hear, especially in the P&C space, more of a focus on that end C customer or the buyer. I guess it's not always a consumer in commercial lines, but the idea of a focus on the end customer more than the distribution channel is a trend. Segmentation, and I don't just mean formal segmentations, but looking at different demographics and different populations of customers and of people, and then helping support the sales function. So this is kind of a high level. We also heard folks are doing much more quant than qual. So what we heard is about 80, on average, 80% plus quant. But what we also heard is people wish they were doing more qual, that they want to do more qual, but that's where budget constraints. It's cheaper, it's easier to do quant. It's often done in-house, and that makes it cheaper and easier to do. But what we heard is, I wish we could do more qual. We heard that so many times. Like, I'd love to do more qual, but we don't have the budget. Can't do that. In terms of internal versus external, folks are keeping in a lot of the tracking stuff, CX, that kind of thing. They're keeping in more straightforward quant, and they're kind of reserving their outsourcing for more complex quantitative studies, difficult audiences that they can't get in-house, and then qualitative. And that's when they're using external resources most often. In terms of within industry, so we asked kind of overall common research topics, and then we asked, what's hot in your industry right now? And you'll see some of these are going to be bolded because they're the same across different sectors. They come up across different sectors. But starting with the health insurance industry, some of the things we heard when we asked about trends within their industry, competitive assessment, so understanding health insurance can be very regional and state specific, so understanding the competitive set in different places and where they perform. Government programs have, in the last several years, been, and when I say government programs, for those of you who aren't in health insurance, like Medicare, Medicaid, have been a focus. They've been very profitable. They've been a place of interest. So that is something they're doing a lot of work on. But I also heard the caveat is we don't know what that's going to be going forward, right? We don't know what's going to happen with those government programs. So that could change. AI in healthcare, how we can use AI in delivering health insurance and healthcare. Communication, claims, always important in this space. And then a digital transformation. That one's bolded because it shows up almost across the board, right? This idea of using digital with or without AI, using technology, using digital to service, to interface, and being more digital forward. P&C space, pricing and profitability, especially when we're facing, climate change issues and weather issues that are causing high numbers of claims. Carriers are pulling out of certain places. It's becoming hard to insure in certain places, in certain business sectors. So that's always a consideration, is how can we underwrite this? How can we provide coverage and do it profitably? Consumer segments and demographics. So looking at different parts, segments of the customer base. Again, digital transformation to some extent with customers, also with agents, quoting, all of that, right? How do we use digital and technology? Innovation and R&D, finding new ways to offer coverages, again, profitably. And the impact of tariffs, particularly in the commercial P&C market. Financial services, market volatility and economic uncertainty, right? The last couple of years, last year have been volatile, uncertain, the interest rate market, all of that affects what products to offer and which ones are most appealing, and how to help deal with that consumer sentiment. Again, customer segments and demographics, looking at different generations, looking at different segments of customers. Again, digital transformation, both from the app side and websites and consumer side or investor side, but also from the financial professional side and the tools that they're using. Education and financial literacy. And then for the advisors, we heard alternatives are something that's become kind of a hot thing, and AI, and how advisors or financial reps could be using AI um, in what they do, in selecting funds, in managing clients' portfolios, et cetera. And finally, group benefit space, non-medical group benefit space. Again, I didn't call it digital transformation here because what we hear is technology and the importance of technology, but balancing that with the human touch. But technology in terms of, again, apps, websites, but also data integration, which is, if you work in the group benefit space, you know how important that is. Mental health, supporting employers, doing some jobs to be done research with employers, understanding their barriers and how to service them better. The changing demographics in the workplace, both in terms of generation, skill set, and then how that's shifting sort of priorities and attitudes in the workplace. Claims integration, just also technology, but this idea of integrating medical claims with other claims like disability or accident or hospital. And then voluntary benefits continue to be a priority, and demonstrating the value of those voluntary benefits and using them to help supplement where medical can be challenging. So that's an overview kind of by topic. Happy afterwards or separately or over email to kind of dive into any for folks who are in that industry and are interested in more detail there. Um, let's talk about the big external trends that we heard about. Uh, so in every interview, when we asked about trends, the first thing for every single person we talked to was AI. Whether they like it or not, that was what came up the first. Every single respondent mentioned AI as the top trend, talking about how it's everywhere. So not only are they seeing it as the top trend and everybody mentioned it, but the sentiment is that this is a game changer, that this is a disruptor, um, maybe on the scale of when we moved from phone to online or when there was kind of DIY like the Qualtrics's of the world and Medallias and people even bigger maybe than that. So I'm just going to bring up a quote here. Comes up a lot. It was interesting because we went to TMRE a couple years ago, and what I was hearing from others is I don't want to sit in another session around AI because at that point in time it was a lot of theory. There weren't a lot of use cases. But since then, obviously, it's gained a lot more traction. There are use cases. Everybody attaches AI to their product offerings. So that is something we heard a lot. It used to be theoretical, and I mean, I say used to like 2 years ago, and now it is everywhere, and it is practical, and it is being used. And I heard a few folks mention to me, I'm seeing use cases. I'm seeing how people are actually doing this, not just talking about it. However, the folks we spoke to, for the most part, feel that their company, um, maybe the industry, is behind when it comes to AI. And I'll pull up another quote here. I think some other industries are embracing AI much faster than financial services. I get worried because I'm like, they're going to be dinosaurs if I can't get them these tools and they can't get permission to use them. I think financial services is literally going to be behind the curve. I've also talked to others in the insurance industry and they're having the same problems. We're so concerned with governance. I mentioned compliance, right, as an issue. And so there is this perception from a lot of the folks we spoke to that AI is super important and it's the future of market research and we're behind. We're not doing it. And we have a couple more slides to kind of talk about what's being done and what isn't. But what I will say is this, even the folks, talked to folks who felt like they were even behind within their industry, within insurance and financial services. That wasn't the case because of the folks we spoke to, there was a lot of parity. There weren't a couple that were like way ahead on using AI and everyone's behind. Kind of everyone was in a very similar place or close to a very similar place. Um, I can't say that they're not behind other industries, but I feel like that's always the case, right? I mean, I feel like the insurance and financial services world is always a little bit behind, like CPG or tech, right? In adopting new methodologies and new approaches and new tools. So I don't think that necessarily that's any different here. I think, it tends to be an industry that follows versus leads when it comes to that kind of thing. But again, within the 16 people we spoke to, there wasn't a huge differential at all in terms of what's being done. Um, so I also asked kind of just from a corporate perspective, was senior leadership at the company conservative when it comes to AI, middle ground, all in, where were they? Most said their company is on the conservative side. Again, it's an insurance industry, financial services industry. It's sort of about managing risk. But a couple did say that the company was pretty gung-ho, more on the financial services side than the other industries that we put up there. Um, but even in the companies, the couple, I think it was two or three that said, I think the company's pretty gung-ho. It hadn't trickled down to research yet. It hadn't gotten there. It hadn't gotten through compliance. So it was in maybe in other places, but not in research and insights. So how is it being used? Sparingly right now. But in terms of future and looking at it, that's broader. So first, kind of how is it being used now? Most folks I spoke to had some sort of generative AI tool, Copilot, which is part of Microsoft, or a customized proprietary closed version of like a chat GPT, right? Some sort of internal tool that they could use. Um, and how are they using those? The chat GPT or those like things were being used to come up with ideas, to come up with wording, to come up with questions, brainstorming. I mean, also to kind of business wise to write emails and things. But when it comes to the research, right? How do I write what are the answer categories I should use in a question about X? Or take these questions and write them in a simpler way. Those kinds of things, writing a guide, something like that. I also heard it being used pretty frequently for secondary research, competitive intelligence research, like go out there and tell me what's going on with XYZ company, gathering information in that way. Although we'll talk a little bit about the barriers and the idea of accuracy comes up here. Being used in other areas of the company. So not research, but like, let's say customer service is using it to analyze calls, or other parts of our organization are using it, but we're not. The only thing beyond sort of the brainstorming and the secondary, a couple folks talked about using it for open-end coding and qualitative transcript summarization, but not a lot. Just a couple. One person talked about personas, that they're experimenting with creating AI personas, but they haven't used it yet. They haven't done anything with it yet. They're just in the experiment stage. In terms of the future, um, lots of folks are looking into how they can use AI, how they will use AI, or are considering using it. And so those two things at the bottom of the left are the two things kind of at the top, right? Those are the low-hanging fruit of, we should be able to use it for coding, right? That's very basic. That should be like the easiest thing AI can do. Should be able to use it to summarize data or summarize transcripts, qualitative, again, seen as low-hanging fruit. Reporting, analysis and reporting. We heard a lot about synthetic data, which I'm happy to have a whole conversation about outside of this if you would like. But the idea of sort of using AI to be your data, to be your respondents in a way, basing it off existing data. Personas, which is similar, right? It's building a persona, feeding it all information you have, and then creating this persona. I call it like a little AI robot of like a financial advisor, and then asking it questions, right? Being able to treat it like a respondent going forward. Using AI for interviewing, moderating, my job, but apparently AI does it as well. These are all things that came up as possibilities. And I shouldn't say, when I say current usage, that means internally. That means them doing it within their company, having permission to use it and use those tools. Not speaking to what they do with vendors. And I'm going to touch on this in a second. So folks may be using more AI or leveraging more AI through vendors outside, but this is more just what they can do internally. Okay, so the last slide on AI here, value, why use it and what are the problems? I think most people see the value as pretty straightforward, right? We had all those challenges at the beginning, and the idea is AI is going to be help me do this faster, more efficiently, lower cost, help me, do more with less, right? Be more efficient, help me with my bandwidth. It's going to take the things off my plate that take up a lot of time and don't add a lot of value. It's going to take the busy work away. That's the best case, right? That's like the most optimistic view of AI isn't going to put me out of a job. It's just going to take the things I don't like to do in my job and do it for me. and make me much more valuable and efficient and effective. Best case, right? What are some of the concerns? What are some things people bring up? Um, Data security and privacy is right now what I'm hearing is the biggest issue, right? That their compliance is struggling with this, and how do we deal with this? And how can we ascertain that any AI tools we use are safe, are closed, won't violate any issues with PII or PHI? Obviously, more important in health insurance, or comes up more strongly in health insurance, but it's across the board here. I mean, I heard that from everybody. Reliability, so how well does it work? And we hear there's worry about bias built in to AI. Hallucinations, I'm sure you've heard, right? Where it's just not accurate, it just makes stuff up, makes up quotes that nobody ever said. Um, and then this idea of an AI loop, if you're just using AI to create AI respondents and then they're learning from AI, like at what point do you lose the actual respondent and the value of that? um, and jobs. Because worst case scenario, I use this example. I've shared this example with a couple people. I sat in on a session earlier this year at a conference where AI wrote the guide, recruited the participants, moderated in-depth interviews, did a highlight reel and a report. And I watched this thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have a job in 5 years. So we'll see. We'll see where that goes. That was CPG, which is a different industry. It was a consumer respondent. It was very straightforward. I think these industries we're talking about are a little more complex. They have more of a B2B component. But still, I do want to mention that of the 16 interviews, one person we spoke to is anti-AI, not a believer, was the quote. They don't like it. They don't want to use it. They don't plan on using it. But they were kind of alone in that. I mean, they still brought it up as a hot topic and a trend, but they were not personally on board. One person also mentioned that it has impacted hiring in terms of the skill set needed for new hires being different in the world of AI. The skills you need in an insights or research professional being different, right? Having to have comfort with technology and using those tools versus maybe more traditional skills. I only heard that from one person, but I think we may hear it more going forward. And then I mentioned vendors, and I do want to bring up, I found it really interesting that a lot of folks told me they can't use AI or very limited, and corporate hasn't allowed them to use some of the tools they want to and leverage it the way they want to, but they're not regulating how their vendors are using it, either through their MSAs or addendums to their MSAs, or even informally by saying, just tell me what tools you're using. One mentioned that they are, but with new MSAs, not necessarily going back to old ones until they expire and come up. And so I'm just putting that as a caveat. I mean, we use AI tools. I'm not anti-AI, but I do think it's interesting. Like if corporate's telling you you can't use them, and to say, well, I'm going to turn a blind eye and let my vendors use them, and and I did hear from two people like that's how they're leveraging them, is they are like letting their vendors use it so they can have the advantage of it without, even though they're not allowed to use them internally. But just a caveat and something to think about. I also want to mention that I used AI for this. We did 16 interviews. I did most of them, but other folks moderated some. So I had a data set. I hadn't done all the moderating. And also, I kind of wanted to try because we are limited. We won't use it for a client unless we have written permission. So, because this was proprietary, I didn't have that same restriction. So, I used Quillet, which is a tool through Civicom, and I used it in a number of different ways. They have different queries, they have summaries, they have subgroup summaries, they have analysis grids. I actually may do a separate webinar case study on how I use AI because I think it's really interesting. I'd be happy offline or after this to walk through what I did and show people kind of the output it produced and everything because I think it's really interesting. But I just wanted to mention that it kind of got meta. The other key trend, external trend that we heard about, kind of secondary to AI, but still really important, is data quality and issues with data quality. Sample quality has been my biggest nightmare. And I don't know who said that, but one of our respondents, I would agree with that. It has been my biggest nightmare as well. I think it's besides AI, it's probably the biggest issue impacting the industry. So what are the issues specifically? Panel data and just not being the people they're supposed to be taking their surveys, right? So the data is not accurate and it's not reflective of the population. Part of that is bots and AI. I will say, and AI can write a verbatim better than a person. So now, where it used to be I read verbatims and I kicked out the ones that were terrible, now sometimes I have to think about kicking out the ones that are too good because they're like perfect and elaborate and have a great vocabulary. Um, so, we're throwing out in consumer data, depending on the partner, we can be throwing out sometimes 50% of our responses. And I think that's a huge red flag. It becomes a red flag of what you're keeping because garbage in, garbage out. And I also think, a lot of these part panel folks and sample folks say, well, I have all of these things that will kick people out if they lie or they're wrong or they're bots, but it doesn't get at the core of who are you letting in and are they really the people they're supposed to be? And how do we make sure that, yes, we can clean and clean and clean, but what's left when we do? So I think also this is impacting feasibility and coming up against expectations. So if business partners or researchers used to be able to get 500 financial advisors, and now it's like, well, can we really? And are they all really who they're supposed to be? Um, it affects how many you can get if you really want that quality. And then what I heard was thought leadership, right? If we're putting something out in a press release with our name on it as a company, we need to feel like that data is accurate, because otherwise that could come back at us. And then, kind of, how are people handling this? I already mentioned internal communities. That's one reason why some of that has blown up, is because at least we can vet them. We know they are who they're supposed to be. Doing qualitative, we hear that a lot because it's pretty quick. You find out if the person's who they're supposed to be when you're doing a focus group or an in-depth interview. Using panels and sources that are validating and vetting their respondents at a higher level. They do exist. They are entering the market. I mean, they're seeing a need there. They are more expensive. I mean, there's no way around that, right? They're going to be more expensive. And I think what we're seeing is the reverse commoditization of panel sample, where it used to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now it's like if you really want good sample, it's going to be more costly. And then just setting those expectations for smaller sample sizes so that we can make sure we're getting a higher quality. We're hearing that, kind of having to push back sometimes internally to say, well, we can't get 500. If you really want, 250 really good ones, we can get that. The last thing I'll put up here, I told people as I was moderating these interviews that this was the selfish part of the discussion because we asked what they value in an external partner. Obviously, this was, something that was we wanted to know for ourselves. But I will also acknowledge that it's biased because two-thirds of these folks were Zeldis clients, and so they work with us. So there's kind of they're going to work with us because if they think we bring the things they value. Anyway, I'll put that out there. But the things we heard most often were trust, which often came from like time and building credibility, long relationship, industry expertise, again, for these kind of specialized industries that we're in, the quality of the work being done, the storytelling and communication, so the report, the visualization, all of that, speed and agility, which is something just ourselves we need to work on to get a little faster, I think, and cost, of course, given the budget constraints that we talked about. I will also mention, even though it was not my favorite thing that we heard, and it doesn't make me happy, but I think it's important to mention that from a couple, not a lot, but still, I thought even 2 or 3 out of 16 was significant. Mention that they're just honestly not, they're seeing a declining need to work with an outside research vendor moving forward because they're going to be using data analytics and not doing as much primary research at all, or because they're using more internal tools and looking to cut costs. But hopefully that's not a huge broad trend because that would be a bummer. But I did want to mention that that was something that we heard. And that's kind of the high level. I have a lot, these were really rich and deep interviews, and I have a lot more I could share, like industry specific as well. So happy to have folks follow up, send me an email. As Brad mentioned, everybody will get the recording for this and the deck that I shared. So you'll be able to share that internally if you'd like. But please reach out if you have any further questions or you want to go any deeper on any of the things we talked about. And if you have any last questions, please send them and Brad will read them to me because I don't have access to, for whatever reason. Or maybe it's in this more and I just didn't know. Yep, it is. Of course it is. So yeah, any other questions, please put them in there. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have a great day.